Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that thought proroguing was taking a 3-level dip into Uncanny Trickster in order to make a really impressive Dread Pirate build. And how are you, Rob?
I'm still recovering from that joke, but I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, and I did double check that is a valid 3.5 D&D build. It won't work in 5th edition, but there you go. Some nerdery for you.
You took the words out of my mouth.
Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. You know, as one tweet I read the other day, they said I'm living in a society where I'm watching The Handmaid's Tale and Chernobyl to feel better about myself. So yeah, that's how things are going over here. How are you?
I'm all right. I had a bit of a freezer issue, but luckily there was enough ice to make a gin and tonic to get us through these trying times. So I'm ready with a gin and tonic. I suppose tonight. This is kind of an emergency episode, but also might as well be the start of season 3. So it's going to be episode 301, and we'll see what happens with doing some extra silly season episodes, because we're going to be talking about the fact that the government's not going to be in session for a bit, so maybe we'll have some time to fit some silly season episodes in. We're not going to do any headlines. We're going to go straight into the main story, because we haven't got time for headlines. We've got to talk about all this nonsense that's going on at the moment. So without further ado, what is proroguing?
Well, what isn't it? Well, it
isn't a D&D character.
It isn't that. It's the hot new word that's on everybody's lips, and I think we've said it so much that it's kind of lost all meaning, you know? Like, everybody's found this new word and they're saying it. But proroguing is basically the suspension of Parliament, in particular for the Queen's speech. So you shut Parliament down or suspend it for usually between 3 to 7 days, and that's so the Queen can get ready and present her speech, and she can open a new session of government.
I suppose, so a lot of claims have gone around the last week. There's been a march, there's been all sorts of things. People saying this is anti-democratic, that this is, using the rules in a different way. And we've been beaten to it, as is often the case, by Brexit Cast with their emergency klaxon episode when it happened. How common is this, and why is it weird this time, or why is it specifically? Why does it seem like a massive problem now, considering this is probably something that happens fairly often?
Okay, so yeah, proroguing is something that happens every year, and is usually scheduled to happen between about April, May, like I said, for the Queen's speech. So Parliament can start a new session of government. They can say, we've revised everything from last year. The Queen is going to outline our plans for the next parliamentary session. For those of you from the US or don't know, the Queen's speech is kind of like the presidential address every year. Apart from in the presidential address in the US, that's the president saying, I wish to do this, but because he doesn't always have the support of the House of Representatives or the Senate, he might not get all of that done. In the case of the UK government, because traditionally the Queen is being told what to say by the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister usually has control of the biggest party in Parliament, it's kind of the Queen saying, this is what the government will do over the next year. We've been in a quite odd situation recently where Parliament has had its longest session in its history. So usually they break up for a year. This parliamentary session, and let me just see if I can get when it started. So it began, the last parliamentary session began on the 13th of June, 2017. And in the article I'm reading, anyway, as of May the 10th, 2019, it was the longest sitting parliament on record, having sat for 298 days, or 2,657 hours and 56 minutes.
That's very, very specific.
Yes. The reason why it was so long, or why they didn't do another Queen's speech, was, you guessed it, Brexit. Hooray!
Hey, my favourite topic.
Yes. Because Parliament was like, right, we need to get, our business of the day is getting a deal, it's getting this done. We're not going to stop until we're able to fulfill this obligation. Clearly, as we all know, this hasn't been done yet. So Boris asking for a proroguing at this stage, well, we're about to discuss it, but there's a number of reasons why that is odd, and Brexit is kind of like the number one with a bullet reason why many people have called this like a coup, or called to stop the coup in the case of many of those on the left.
Yeah, so I suppose, as you said, it happens every year. It's not an unusual thing, but politically right now, with Brexit only, let's get our clocks out. I'll remove the maths there. We've got 59 days.
It's 59 days with a scheduled break in it as well. So usually Parliament breaks up for conference season, and they have about 3 or 4 weeks out, I believe. This time, Boris has decided to take the proroguing period right before the conference season, so that it runs into just after the conference season as well, which has the double whammy of making this, like, forcing Parliament not to sit for 5 weeks, which is massive, particularly when they've just come off of a summer break of 6 weeks. And the other point is that because he's stopping it just before the parliamentary session, it stops MPs having a vote on if they don't want to do conference season and they want to sit for those 3 or 4 weeks they should have had off instead.
Considering Brexit is so close, they could have said, we're gonna sit during conference season and maybe, nip out and every now and again, but we're gonna deal with Brexit because it's looming.
Yeah, exactly. And Boris has closed down all those options for MPs should they want to take. I think MPs probably would have done conference season anyway, but they may have liked to have had the option if a new Brexit deal came up from the EU or something is agreed. That's something that's going to take a lot of time for Parliament to discuss. If you think how long it took Theresa May's deal to go through the Commons, to go through the Lords, it took 3 attempts of the Prime Minister trying to get that deal through before it failed on each occasion. The idea that Boris thinks he can come along with a new deal and get it passed within a matter of weeks without it being properly scrutinised, like that's another factor where people are saying you're taking time away from Parliament and forcing us into a corner, something that, something we don't want to do. We want to have the time to discuss what is, I don't think this is arguable. It's one of the most important constitutional decisions the UK has faced.
Yeah. So by forcing a shortening of the timeline, do we think Boris is trying to force a no deal? Or do you think he is actually trying to convince the EU that he's serious about a no deal? Because that's kind of the talk. Some people are like, oh, he just wants a no deal for his mates. But then he has repeatedly said, whether you can take that on trust or not with Boris, that he wants to get a better deal, remove the backstop, that kind of stuff. Do you think he honestly thinks that the EU will realise he's really serious and therefore suddenly try and take something out, even if we don't think the EU will necessarily do that? Or do you think this is he's just trying to push fully for no deal?
So I think he's trying to push fully for no deal, but I'll give you Boris's words and the way that he describes it. I mean, Boris in his speech tonight said that he thought his approach with the EU was working, and he gave 3 reasons for that. 1, that they can see that we want a deal. 2, they can see that we have a clear vision for our future relationship with the EU, something that has perhaps not always been the case. Now, on a side note, I think those last words are a little bit odd. I think Theresa May was always quite clear with her future relations for the EU, and if anything, Boris has been, he's been Mr. No Deal. He's been Mr. We leave by the 31st or bust. That's him. So I'm not quite sure where that second comment comes from. And the third one he said in the speech was, they can see that we are utterly determined to strengthen our position by getting ready to come out regardless what may. So he's saying that by presenting a no deal, we prove to them that we're serious, and I think at the last minute the EU will cave and they'll give us a better deal, certainly one that will garner support of Parliament, something that Theresa May was unable to do. However, the possibility of the EU giving him a deal is very slim. Over the summer, he met with Merkel and Macron, and they both said, they've been talking. The big sticking point is the backstop. Boris wants it gone because that's the thing that the RG got most hung up on about. Essentially, they said that it might be a backdoor to indefinite EU membership if they were unable to find a solution for the Irish border. The EU's position is, well, we still need an agreement on the Irish border in some shape or form, and you haven't come up with anything yet. Merkel very much pushed the ball back into Boris's court and said, we'll be open to a new deal if you can find an alternative to the backstop. Go off and do it. The evidence that he's found anything to replace this backstop is very thin on the ground. So I think that makes the possibility of a deal very weak indeed. However, the other point is that the EU is somehow scared by this no deal, I think is also a miscalculation by Boris Johnson. This is something that I picked up in a recent New Statesman article, and Stephen Bush, if you don't follow him on Twitter, do that. He's an excellent commentator. He does a daily roundup for Parliament, and that's really useful. You can get an email sent to your inbox every day. He was saying that one of the key facets of us saying that we're serious about a no deal should also be us preparing for a no deal. So the government has done a lot saying that, they launched I can't remember exactly what it's called now, the Brexit campaign, the Get Ready for Brexit push. Being Brexit ready, I think that's what it was called, where it's this hugely expensive project to get the message out to people on how they can prepare if there's a no deal on the 31st. However, we're seeing very little action in places like the Irish border or in our ports. Other places in Ireland, there was an article I read the other day about preparations for ports where they've grossly expanded their capacity. They're prepared to take on new workers. They know that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, that you'll need a lot more people to process the goods if you're still going to have a good flow between the two countries. Britain's done nothing to that extent. We've done very little real planning or action on the surface to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. We're just saying it a lot. So that is ultimately why I think Boris's push for a new deal will be unsuccessful, and whether Boris wants one or not, I think no deal becomes the far more likely outcome because A, he's unable to get a deal, and B, he's always said that come the 31st, we're leaving come what may. And without a deal, the only other option is to crash out, essentially.
One thing I've seen being discussed is how the EU and the UK keep misconstruing what each other mean. So, for example, you mentioned Merkel's comments. And so Johnson comes back and says, oh, well, look, they're willing to do a deal now that we're threatening no deal. But actually what she said is you need to come up with a solution to the backstop, which she thinks is impossible outside of what's already been put forwards. So she's essentially saying, well, there's no way we can renegotiate because you have to fix the backstop problem. And Boris has gone, oh, that means they're willing to negotiate, so I'll come back and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of talking past each other seems to happen a lot. And I don't know how much of that is intentional or people actually misunderstanding what the other side has said.
I think a lot is intentional. You're speaking to, there's a message for people at home there, and Boris, for the people at home, will want to firmly put the blame on the EU. That's what his, if we go out with a deal, it won't have been for the UK's lack of trying. It was because the EU wasn't willing to drop the backstop. That will be the message that he's promoting. And I don't know if you've seen a slight shift in language from people, particularly on the Brexit side. The no deal is now being scrapped, and the Brexit Party are promoting what they call a clean break from the European Union, which is no deal in every other way, shape or form, but it sounds nicer, doesn't it? A clean break.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what you can get away with by just changing the words on something. But, I mean, no deal, having no in something, right, sounds inherently a bit bad. I mean, we know what no deal is, so they can't really go and kind of, well, I mean, they're obviously trying to rebrand it, but it doesn't necessarily work. So I suppose moving on from that, you were talking about how we're going to deal with no deal and that we haven't really got much preparation. How does that line up with what the speech that we had today that Boris was, well, I mean, Boris called a speech, we all sat around and checked our phones or watched TV, and it was a bit like when Theresa May called one earlier in the year, and it was kind of a waste of everyone's time, in my opinion. But what was he saying that we're going to do, and more importantly, where's this magic money tree?
Well, he said very little on what he was actually going to discuss with the EU. In the speech, he talks a lot about a deal, and that he says the EU wouldn't want a. He says that any move by MPs to stop a no deal would completely undermine his negotiating position. That's what he comes across at. He doesn't offer any solutions for the Brexit deal in particular. More of his speech is about home affairs. So we mentioned about why he wants a Queen's speech, why he's proroguing Parliament. Part of this is he says, well, as a new leader, I've got a lot of new ideas. Sajid Javid's going to announce something on Wednesday where, let me get that piece from the speech right at the top. He says, on Wednesday, Chancellor Sajid Javid is going to set out the most ambitious spending plan for more than a decade. I want to make your streets safer. We're recruiting 20,000 police officers. I want to improve your hospitals by reducing waiting times for GPs. We're doing 20 new hospital upgrades in addition to the extra 34 billion going into the NHS.
So I suppose my two questions here are maybe three points to make. One, where is this money coming from?
Should we start with number one?
Yeah, okay. Let's start with number one. Where is this money coming from? This magical money we're going to have when we fall out of the EU?
I think the 34 billion to the NHS is pointed because I think it's 39 billion we need to pay the EU in our divorce settlement deal, something that Johnson has already said he won't pay. So that instantly transfers across. Again, you say NHS. You think of the bus, we send this much to the EU, let's spend it on the NHS instead. This is Johnson, in some terms, saying, let's take the money we would have spent on the EU divorce bill and spend it on the NHS instead. I think that's what he's doing anyway.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, if he believes we can get away without paying that, then that's a reasonable argument, but also I think we might struggle to get away with not, reneging on all our debts. The other thing is, is this a pitch for an election? Because there's been all this talk about, maybe there'll be a general election. And then he came out today and said, there won't be an election. We're definitely going to do a no-deal Brexit. So do you think he's trying to set himself up as the person, kind of going in with all the rhetoric he's had so far, he's setting himself up as the person who's going to deliver Brexit, and then everyone else is like an enemy of the people, inverted commas, trying to get in the way. And if there was a general election, then he can say, well, look, no, I was trying to do Brexit and you stopped me.
Precisely. Yeah. His message tonight was a warning to his own MPs who look to stand against him and to those in what the papers have termed the Rebel Alliance. So that's Corbyn, Swinson, Change, the SNP with Sturgeon, even though she doesn't sit in the Houses of Parliament, she certainly has a lot to say on the issue. His point of view is that if you tie my hands and say that we're going to stop no deal, then I'll left, I said I was going to take us out on the 31st. That's what he's always said, and he says that in his speech. I want everybody to know that there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We are leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs or buts. I will not accept any attempt to go back on our promises or scrub that referendum. Okay? So that's him sort of nailing to the post, right, that's it. And if you force me to do it, then what other options does he have? He said in that, and without an election, he said, I want our negotiators to get back to their work without that sword of Damocles over their heads and without an election, which I don't want and you don't want. It's kind of saying, I don't want this election, the people don't want this election, but if I have to call one, I will, and it'll be framed as Boris Johnson, who stands for the people, against the evil MPs who are stopping the will of the people at all costs. That's the way he wants to frame it anyway, and that's why he called this speech at 6 p.m. today. He gets to give, he could have said in private to his Conservative colleagues, look, I run a risk of calling a general election if you don't speak to me, if you don't support my plans or if you go against my wishes and stop a no-deal Brexit. So please don't. But by saying it to the people, he then seeds the ground for a general election to get people on the side and on his side, and make sure that the narrative is in the best possible position for him to call that general election, if he chooses to do so. And the word on the street is that if a bill passes tomorrow, stopping no deal, that he will call an election for October 14th.
I know we've touched on this before, but we've just had a tweet posted in the chat talking about the fact that he can't just call an election. So what would he be able to do to make an election happen? So if that bill goes through, then so what is that bill, and why would that cause a general election to happen? Because if Boris can't just decide, thanks to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, that there is going to be a general election unless he gets approval of MPs. Okay,
so the bill has been released by Hilary Benn, a prominent spokesman for Labour, and I think he stands on many of the EU, the parliamentary committees on leaving the European Union. Thank you for posting that. That's got 8 parts to it and is very parliamentary in its language and phrasing. But from what I could contend with it, Section 4 is the most interesting. It says that Parliament will try and do a deal and is still up for a deal. However, if we don't reach a deal by the 31st of October, our default position will not be no deal. It will be going back to the EU and asking them for an extension. And the extension they propose is until the 31st of January 2020, which gives us about 3 months more to do a deal. This is particularly attractive for a number of people, particularly Remainers on all sides of the Commons. It doesn't, they're not saying, and we want a general election. They're not saying, and we want Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. It gives Conservative MPs who want to support it an out, and they say, look, we're just giving us more time, because at the moment you've stopped us from having more time. And it doesn't take no deal off the table forever. It just takes no deal off the table for October 31st, which I think a lot of Conservative MPs and those who don't support a no deal, they feel the country isn't ready for one. They feel that the consequences at this stage, when we're so underprepared, would be disastrous. So that's the bill itself. The reason Boris Johnson is worried this will pass is that he's in quite a precarious position as leader of the Conservatives. They have a working majority of 1, and that is with the support of the DUP. We already know that there are a number of Conservatives who are very fundamentally against a no-deal Brexit, and I think I've left another tweet there on our notes that lists all of them. There's 22 in total, but there we go. I think the ones to pick out from that list are Philip Hammond, ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer, who has been very vocal in his criticism of Boris Johnson, in particular his, proroguing Parliament and then his no-deal attempts. Ken Clarke, Gawke, who's done a lot of speeches for the BBC on his approach to no-deal Brexit. Rory Stewart, who was quite a prominent candidate during the Conservative leadership election. Dominic Grieve, you might remember his name from the Grieve Amendment that essentially tied Theresa May's hands and made sure that she, had to keep extending Brexit the first time round. All of these people aren't, shy retiring backbenchers. There's a lot of heavy hitters in there.
And they're people who've been on the front benches in the past as well.
Precisely, yeah. Knowing that you've got 22 big hitters like that already out in public saying that against you, there's likely to be more. So Boris knows that it's a real possibility that he's going to lose. The letter that you've posted there from Philip Hammond raises a number of what I would say are quite sensible questions that Boris has completely failed to answer.
So he has 6 questions. What steps have been taken since your visit to Berlin 11 days ago to set out the UK's proposals for alternative text to replace the backstop in the withdrawal agreement? So something we've already touched on. To confirm that the UK's proposed revisions to the withdrawal agreement are limited to the backstop, so that's the only thing we want to change. To publish the UK's proposals for revisions to the withdrawal agreement before Parliament reconvenes tomorrow. To confirm that the UK's proposals have been finally communicated to the EU. To commit to publish the response received from the EU to the UK's proposals as soon as it is received. And set out what specific negotiation meetings have taken place between the EU and UK since the trip to Berlin. And what progress has been achieved in them. So, yeah, I mean, very sensible list of questions, I would say. What have you done, basically?
Yeah, and he hasn't had a response to that because I think the answer, as we all know, is nothing. He doesn't have an alternative proposal for the backstop. If his changes are just limited, the backstop is Hammond going, is this an easy change? Is this something where we can take Theresa May's deal that she brought to Parliament and say, it's just the same except we've got rid of the backstop? In that case, it's very easy to quickly pass through Parliament. If there are a lot of changes, then it's going to have to go through several readings again. Time becomes a factor before the 31st. How much do we have to go through it? Other bits like to publish the UK's proposals for revisions, that's all about time. Making sure the European Union know it is essentially saying you can't bring something to Parliament where the EU haven't agreed to it, because otherwise we're all wasting our time here. And then the other two are very much linked to how the EU would respond. And essentially, if Boris is unable to answer question A on this list, it's very unlikely he's going to be able to answer question number F.
And So if there are 22 that we know of who are kind of openly rebelling, as you say, there was a talk of deselecting MPs if they voted against this bill. So there's now a new tweet saying that Tory MPs will lose the whip unless they vote against the bill. So not just abstentions. So potentially that parliamentary mathematics of having a majority of one could suddenly shift. I mean, obviously, they were previously Conservative MPs. They may still vote on other issues with Parliament. But on the case of Brexit, as we've discussed, it doesn't go down normal party lines necessarily. So how do you... If you had to make a prediction right now about that vote, what would you say? And also, how many do you think are going to face deselection over this?
I think that, people like Hammond and Clark will vote the way they want to on Brexit. They're not going to be scared by that. If you're going to make one decision that ends your parliamentary career, it might as well be on one of the most constitutionally important one of our generation. So I don't think that they'll be scared by that. It might be seen as a bit of bully tactics from the PM, particularly the PM's office. This email came from Dominic Cummings, who was the Vote Leave campaign director during the referendum. He was portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch in that Channel 4 serialisation. He's a bit of a character, as some people would say. He certainly got a reputation for, wielding the axe and not being, using those sorts of tactics to get what, needs to be done. And what he thinks needs to be done is that the UK needs to leave the EU as soon as possible. It's also this is why it makes a general election more likely, because you lose that vote tomorrow. Suddenly you're without a majority in Parliament. So the only way to get that majority back is to call a general election. There's no point trying to hang around whilst you've deselected 22 of your MPs. And Boris Johnson might look at the constituencies where those MPs reside. He might say, oh, those are very pro-Brexit areas. I can, in this general election I'm calling where it's Boris Johnson versus Parliament, where it's, Boris Johnson, where it's the public versus Parliament, then it'll be very easy to get rid of these pro-Remain MPs. I think some of which, I can't remember which, if it was Grieve or Gawke, but one of them has already faced the threat of deselection from the internal party because of their actions because of their actions in Parliament trying to, stop a Brexit deal being passed. So he might say, these people had it coming, we'll lose them for a day, but I'll regain them in a general election, and I'll regain them with MPs who support Boris Johnson. That'll be his calculation anyway.
So with that, I mean, he's saying don't vote for Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't want a general election, you don't want one to his MPs. If he loses this vote tomorrow, which seems possible at least, I might say likely, based on what we've just said, then what are his options? If we're falling into a general election, what are his options?
So I've outlined three options, and I think, outlining these three explain why people are gearing up for a general election now. So option one is that he follows it. He says, I'm PM, it's my constitutional duty to follow the will of Parliament. Parliament have said I want an extension, I'll ask for an extension. That is what some might call a very Theresa May move. That's what she was forced to do. But it would instantly shatter Boris's core support. He got voted in on, I'm going to leave on the 31st, no matter what. That's what's happening. If he does that, then you'll see the Brexit party surge in the polls again. The Conservatives will start to lose support. We've seen in the Council and the EU elections what that message for Conservatives sent. It spelt electoral disaster. So if Boris Johnson wants to save the Conservative Party, he'll do everything in his power not to enact the will of Parliament if that no deal clause is passed. So the next thing he can do is disobey Parliament, say, you voted on that, but I think I'll ignore it, and I'll carry on with my negotiations. This causes another constitutional crisis. You can't do that. It is illegal for the PM to ignore the will of Parliament, particularly on, such an important piece of legislation. It's not advisory. It's not one of these bills where when Parliament was all getting together after Theresa May's deal and thinking, should we put some options forward in a free vote? It's nothing like that. It would cause a definite constitutional crisis. We're not just talking about a dodgy proroguing, because I think we haven't really got into the constitutional bits about the proroguing, but
no, we haven't mentioned the Queen or stuff like that.
We'll go on. I'll go on a slight tangent then. So that was just people are attacking Boris for his constitutional right to prorogue Parliament. He is within his rights to do so, and actually, it's only the Queen that can prorogue Parliament. But in an unusual quirk of how the British Constitution works, the Queen is head of state, but really she's got to do what the PM tells her. So the PM says, I want to prorogue Parliament, and she's got to say yes. Because if she says no, then she risks a crisis of people saying the Queen won't do what the Prime Minister wants. That's how the Queen gets forced out of power, essentially, in short terms. So Boris was completely within his constitutional right to prorogue Parliament, even if he chose the most, the most opportune time for him to delay Brexit negotiations. That's why people were calling it a coup. That's why people were calling it an affront to democracy, because he was, stopping free debate in Parliament. If Boris Johnson was to disobey Parliament for legislation, that is definitely going against the Constitution. That's something judges could immediately say, and legal advice from his team would just say, you can't do this. So that makes that option very, very unlikely. So what other options does he have left to him there? The only other option really is call a general election, change the parliamentary math, try and get a pro-Boris Johnson, a pro-no-deal government into power, one that will agree with him. In the process, he might lose a lot of pro-Remain MPs. What does he care? He wants a pro-Boris Johnson government. And he does it, crucially, if he's going to do it October the 14th, then he does it before we get to see the impact of no-deal Brexit.
He's riding high on the idea being he steals back most of the Brexit Party votes because he's actually doing it, and you can see that in the polls, which we'll get to in a bit, that they're moving back over to the Conservatives again from the Brexit Party. So he could go and do that. He could consolidate. He would presumably assume he's going to consolidate his current polling numbers with most of the Brexit Party vote if he offers to actually make it happen, and then he would have a significant majority against Labour.
Yeah, precisely. So that's the reasons why it might succeed. However, if he was to do it, it's still like a very high risk option in a number of different ways. And
briefly back to the vote, is there an incentive for Labour here to call a general election? Because Corbyn seems to be up for it, but then you've had people like Tony Blair saying, "Don't do this. It's a trap. You'll lose this." Because as you say, they currently have a majority of one with people voting against them. And if we deselect those MPs going into a general election, then he could maybe end up with more pro-Brexit MPs, even if they're not Conservative Party ones. So, is it likely to are Labour going to push for that?
Labour probably would try and force a vote of no. Well, Labour would prefer a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson, because then the narrative changes from I called a general election because Parliament wouldn't do what I say to we forced the Prime Minister out because he was incompetent and unwilling to listen to the will of Parliament. That those two are very different narratives, but they both end in a general election. So Labour would prefer the no confidence vote. Secondly, Labour to sort of sit on their hands and do nothing and wait out to see what happens to the 31st would be a very bad look for them. I feel Labour have suffered in the polls, let's say, because of their so-called do-nothing approach to Brexit. You can debate how much they have done or not until the cows come home, but they do seem to have come out as pro-Remain quite late in the day. There was a lot of soul-searching, and I think the results of the council elections and the EU elections really forced Labour to come out in favour of being pro-Remain, because they saw what the damage was being done to their polling numbers by sitting on the fence. And lastly, when it comes to calling a vote to say that you want to have an election, the Prime Minister can't just do that anymore. He needs to have the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which was meant to make sure we only had an election every 5 years.
Yeah. And has failed to do so pretty much since it was introduced.
Exactly. Because the one crucial failure is that the Prime Minister says we're going to call a general election. Come at me if you think you're hard enough. Any opposition is going to go, yeah, sure, we're hard enough. If they say, oh no, don't want one now, then it automatically makes them look weak. And at the next the next chance voters come to vote, that is a easy line. That's an easy attack line for any Conservative saying Labour didn't want this general election because they thought they'd lose. go and prove it to them that they're going to go out there and lose. Jeremy Corbyn has to say, yes, I'm ready to fight a general election. Yes, we'll do that, because he's got to look at it positively. It's very important that, any government, any party that's going to be successful in an election needs to want that election to happen.
So we're in this very precarious position where we've gone from being like, oh, no one's going to want to call a general election this year, to it might happen. Do we have any feelings? Are we going to look at the polls at this point, I suppose?
I think let's have a look at the polls and just say, I think that's another thing that confirms why Boris Johnson feels that he wants to have a general election.
I know we do it every week, but these are the averaged polls across all polls, like a rolling average. Yeah, so you can see the Conservatives are currently about a 9% lead. As I said, the Brexit Party, you can see that curve there. The Brexit Party have dropped down to 12.5%, and Conservatives have risen back up to 33.3%, and it looks pretty. I mean, the shape is there. You can tell that a large number of people who are supporting the Brexit Party are now going back to the Conservatives, and that puts them in a lead over Labour. And we know that even when they're neck and neck, they can still get more MPs than Labour due to how first past the post works. So, yeah, it doesn't look like a strong position for Labour right now.
No, I'm going to cast your mind back to 2017, though, where the Conservatives had a stonking 20-point margin over Labour. And over the course of a 6-week campaign, managed to tank it and end up nearly losing that election. These aren't as strong polling numbers as back in 2017, and as we know, a lot can change over 6 weeks. I think if he was to call a general election, like I said, October 14th, I think that does make it around about 6 weeks for the election campaign, so we would have the full length. But I would argue that, at least on the surface, Boris seems a more capable campaigner than Theresa May, and might be.
And also, Corbyn has had his fair share now. Like, his problem has all essentially been he's been in opposition too long. After a while, people start to think, A, you might be a bit of a damp squib because you're still in opposition, and B, you've had your fair share of problems, whereas Boris seems to, as you know, get away with his kind of bumbling persona. A lot of the stuff he has done. I mean, I think we've said before, Boris is kind of Marmite. Those who don't like him already know they don't like him, so he's not going to win those over. But if those got those kind of polling numbers, they could well be getting all those Brexiteers over with his promises of Brexit.
Yeah, and I think Boris can almost market this as a new Conservative Party. Like I would say under normal circumstances, any ruling party that attempts to seek re-election after 10 years would have the baggage of that 10 years on them. The Conservatives should be going to this election with the baggage of austerity with them, like, oh my goodness, you've been in power since 2010, I think was the last. Yeah, 2010 was when David Cameron went into coalition with the Lib Dems. You've had to do austerity. All of these things are, these failures are because of you, or, you've got things that build up over 10 years that make people think, oh, it's time for a change. Boris can come in and say, I'm a change, I'm different, it's just a change within the Conservative Party, particularly as he hasn't even sat in a session of Parliament once. I think the first time he's going to do it is tomorrow, when he's going to face that bill and probably lose. So he won't have that record behind him, which means he can be the fresh face of the Conservative Party, and hopefully that will, hopefully for Boris's, from Boris's point of view, that will push him to an election victory. So that's where the polls stand. Also, if you have a look at the polls you mentioned the curve for the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, the other clear correlation is that as Labour have gone down, the Lib Dems have gone up. And that tends to be a Conservative dream, because they can say, oh, brilliant, Lib Dems are going to take votes away from Labour. That clears, if the left is split, then that once again raises our chances, because I'm going to call myself out on a bad way of doing polling, because you should never just add numbers together. There will always be a core vote for the Liberal Democrats, no matter what the situation. But if you add Labour and the Liberal Democrats' votes together, then you get something that will beat the Conservative Party by quite some way.
And we know that's not necessarily strictly how this works with first past the post, as we mentioned, but if the Lib Dems plus Labour plus the Greens have got significantly more than the Conservatives, then they can outvote them on a lot of issues, even if technically the Conservatives have a majority. If they're the biggest party, like they might, you could end up with a split there, so that the Conservatives have less than 50% of the seats, which would mean they could be outvoted on traditional party stuff very easily. But as we've already touched on, there's going to have to be some Labour MPs fighting on a Brexit stance, right? Because some of them are Brexiteers, but also some of them are going to be in heavily Brexity areas, and they'll have to talk about. I know Labour's come out as Remain, but I feel like there'll definitely be some MPs who are know that their area is Brexit, has voted for Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be once again a very interesting election, particularly if for Labour up in the north, where you tended to have those more pro-Brexit areas. But the ground is the polls are good for the Conservatives, but not outstanding, not to the extent that you would think it would be a landslide. And I've posted in, I don't know if you want it, there's a link that I found on Twitter of a quick poll done by the Financial Times that essentially says that the Conservatives would struggle to get a majority if they held an election today. It would be another hung parliament, and the Conservatives would actually lose 6 seats rather than gain any. And one of the big problems the Conservatives have, and this is my little... I feel like I say this a lot on this podcast, and I feel like it's one of those things like, oh, Rob's harping on about this again. And it's one of those side notes that is taken completely out of English politics. Scottish politics is one of the reasons I think we've had a hung parliament for so long, or is one of the reasons why any government has really struggled to get a majority, particularly after 2015 and the Scottish referendum. Scotland is an area that voted almost unanimous. Well, every area in Scotland did vote to stay in the European Union. So they're an entire nation that's very much against this no deal plan. Also, they're a nation that has a lot of MPs from a party that is not one of the main two parties, Labour or Conservatives. So Labour, if they were hoping to win, they'd have to take a lot of seats in Scotland. That seems very unlikely at the moment with how they're polling up there. Or the Conservatives would have to see a similar success that they saw in 2017. And a lot of that was down to Ruth Davidson, who our listener has pointed out and reminded me that, she resigned this week. She said that it was for a mixture of personal and political reasons. She's recently had her first child. But a lot of it was to do about Boris Johnson's approach to Brexit. And I think that she was one person who single-handedly was able to go up to Scotland and say, look, I'm not like those English Tories down there. I'm pro-Europe. I want to look for a deal that does the best for Scotland if we have to. And also, I'm pro-union. I'm pro-keeping everybody together. And in 2017, Ruth Davidson's Conservatives were responsible for winning 12 seats. That's a huge swing, and probably one that saved Theresa May's bacon. Because if she didn't have those 12 seats, then even the confidence and supply deal with the DUP, I don't think it would have been quite enough for them to get an outright majority in the House of Commons, and would have made life a hell of a lot more difficult than it was for Theresa May when it came to Brexit stuff. So that's where, and I think that's reflected in that poll, in that flash poll that says that there'll be a hung parliament. The SNP are winning 13 seats, does it say? 17 seats. And guess where they're going to win those seats? It's not going to be in Kent, is it? It's going to be in Scotland. So that poses a real problem for the Conservatives and for Labour. And I don't think another hung parliament helps Boris one bit. He could be... I think I said it on multiple previous podcasts when we've talked about Boris and why... I said one of the reasons why I didn't think he'd hold a general election is he could go down in history as the Prime Minister who served in office for one day, called a general election, and then lost, And he still could be that Prime Minister. If he takes that risk, if he takes that gamble and loses, and a Remain side wins, or he can't get the majority and we're still in this quagmire, then he can't go forward with his promise. Or he would go into a no deal knowing that the British public were against him and that it was very likely to backfire. Yeah, general election likely, but still not the. It's probably the only option he's got left, not the best option he has.
And so, general election, we feel likely, which doesn't sound fun.
I mean, Boris said it himself, like, I don't want it, you don't want it. I'm like, yeah, Boris, I don't, but I'm still going to vote in it. Like, I'm still going to, do my thing.
But yeah, so we think it's likely. What are the EU thinking? Like, I mean, they're very much wait and see, I assume, because they just have to see what happens tomorrow and over the next few days.
Let me see if I can grab the quote. I saw one earlier that basically said that the EU basically were mouth agape at what was happening. This one is from the BBC newsfeed, 1933. EU leaders opened mouth at latest developments. Basically, they think that that their negotiating partners in the UK don't know what they're up to. They can't organise anything. What are they up to? One Finnish leader said, it's a live feed, so it keeps jumping up and down. A cabinet minister in Finland, meanwhile, described himself as so gobsmacked by the idea Prime Minister Boris Johnson will suspend Parliament at such a time of political crisis, he likened it to the Finnish government trying to announce a national ban on saunas.
Amazing.
So they are already bemused about what's going on in the UK, about the proroguing. They will be even more gobsmacked if it comes to a general election. They will just see it as wasting time. When they were first given the extension, Donald Tusk was told Theresa May to use the time wisely. I don't think that we can honestly say that we have used that time wisely.
No, I think we've messed about. I mean, the royal we, not me personally.
Yes.
But yeah, we've kind of messed everyone about and not got anywhere as far as I can tell. I mean, I think the civil service are doing a fair amount of preparing because they have to. But other than that, I don't think there's much of note going on. We're just messing about.
Yes, we've been dealing with our own internal crises and trying to do that, thinking that will solve it. And so far, none of them has come up with the answer. And I don't see what Boris Johnson will be able to do within the next... The general election is the last roll of the dice here. The best scenario for Boris Johnson will be get the general election, win with a majority so big that they will approve whatever deal he puts in front of them, if he gets a better one from the EU, or just one that will support no deal and will say all the right things in interviews for him, and then go ahead with it. That's where we are at now, unfortunately.
Well, so...
ending on a high as usual.
Hey! So, I mean, yeah. As I said, we're counting this as the start of Season 3, because... it's going to be a wild ride, I think. It always was going to be a bit interesting, but it's got a lot more interesting in the last few days. So, I mean, I think it very much depends on how quickly we can get together to record. I mean, we've mentioned what we wanted to about a general election. So if one is suddenly called tomorrow, we're not going to be doing a sudden surprise episode on that. But we might be back with more normal episodes slightly more often than usual, depending on what's actually going on. And also... we will likely be fitting in a few silly season episodes in between as well, because maybe we don't have anything to talk about if Parliament prorogues and everything's a bit normal. So watch this space, I suppose. Keep tuned to the feed, keep subscribed, pay attention to YouTube wherever you watch us. As always, you can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us at reddit.r/r/unparliamentary. And you can find us on Twitter and Instagram as Unparl Podcast. And also you can always find us in your podcast app of choice. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to spread a podcast. So if you think what we're saying is worth listening to, please let someone know. And you can always join us on Discord. There's a link in the show notes, so you can come and listen to us recording live and be involved in the chat as our listeners are right now. And finally, if you want to throw some money our way to get us through the hard Brexit times ahead, go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support everything we do here at Tinker Tailor Soldier Sponge Productions. Yeah, I mean, hopefully, I don't know, we did mention the other day we might be doing a crossover episode, I think, with Mishmash Mayhem. I can't remember if I mentioned that on the podcast or not. I have mentioned their podcast a few times. So that might add some levity to the situation, as we're going to do a crossover episode, I think, with them. And maybe one on their feed, one on our feed. But yeah, watch this space. I suppose there's nothing else to say other than it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I believe now everything is in and recording. Okay, let's
Cool.
get running. Oh yes, I wrote down that I have a joke and then I didn't bring it up.
It's fine.
Give me a second.
That's
I'm
okay.
preparing for this.
Oh, okay. Big. You're building it up. Never.
Oh, the UK government.
We can't do anything.
And that's how you get into the outtakes, kids.
We can't do anything better than that. Shut it down. This podcast's over. The listeners have taken over. They're better than us. They know it.